So the first time I met Pete, I saw this old man in a really raggedy flannel shirt with a baseball cap on, and didn't think much of him. I was like, okay, he's probably like gonna climb all the easy stuff, right?
But he didn't look like this sort of Adonis guy, like some of these guys with long blonde hair and the guy's ripped. And Pete didn't have that look. He had a little more of like he had like a little bit of a nerdy look to him. But you could see the minute the guy started to climb, he was just incredibly strong. He was like genetically super strong.
But to my surprise, he turned out to be seriously one of the best climbers I've ever seen in my life. He was a real character. He knew a lot about science, of course, because he was, I think it was like a chemistry engineering major at MIT. Very smart guy, you can tell already. But then later, I think for some reason, he went over to medicine. He became a doctor. He worked at one of the penitentiaries in Wisconsin as a doctor. And also he was a general practitioner in the Baraboo area for many years as well.
I always found the guy fascinating. He was one of these guys, he was incredibly erudite. You could ask him about almost any subject and the guy would just rattle on about it, I mean, if you gave that dude an IQ test, I don't know, I would guess, he would be 160 IQ. He struck me as a guy who was just a brilliant guy, I think he retired in his, I want to say in his late 40s, early 50s. He was very frugal and he said, I can live on the rest of money the rest of my life. So
he was just being frugal. He's a very frugal person. Whenever we go to his house, he would always give us the cheapest beer, like Coors, and then he would have Sam's Club cola if we wanted cola, just like, and he would always serve really cheap food. Like he would get pepperoni from Aldi's. We always ate the same food basically at his house. It was very, very simple. So that translated into his climbing gear as well. So we would always tease him about like, oh yeah, Pete's gear is from the 1980s or something. And literally it looks like seatbelt, like there's just a big strap and, but yeah, he belayed us on it and nobody died. But it was kind of funny. And then, in fact, his house, okay, there's no running water there. He would actually collect water from his roof and it would funnel into a cistern at the bottom of his house. And that's what he would use to, take showers, flush toilets, things like that. And even, wash his dishes. And then he didn't have a heating system either. He would use a stove, what do you call those? Just like one of those wood burning stoves. If you go to the back of his house, there would be rows and rows of like split wood. So on his property, as trees fall, he would go and harvest that, cut it, break it down, and then he would burn that entire winter. And Wisconsin winters are not warm. Yeah, he would survive this whole winter, doing that. So yeah, very frugal. So that's why that translated into his climbing gear as well. So we would have regular outings at Devil's Lake, and we have our own campsite at the Chicago Mountaineering Club. And he would drive up in this kind of beat up Ford Ranger, red pickup truck. And he would join us for climbing. He was very, very chatty, and he would talk about everything under the sun.
There were times when you'd avoid him and be like, I don't have the time to talk to Pete right now because it's not going to be a 5-minute conversation. He could go, he liked, and I think a little bit of it, he lived, he raised his kids and he lived alone. So climbing was a lot of his social life. So, and especially if he got in a discussion where he loved to talk. So yeah, you had to be careful with him that you had the time. Because once you started, you couldn't, you just walk away and he'd just keep talking,
Because he was a doctor, so he would kind of know some of the physiologies and stuff like that. And, in the middle of a climb, he would give us a introduction to some medical thing like, oh yeah, your body works this way or that. I was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that's pretty interesting, So it's like you had a live encyclopedia, a medical expert to explain to you exactly, why certain things was happening. So it was kind of interesting.
And my connection with Pete was, I was a woodworker by trade, and he, when he got, he was a guy who was he was a doctor, a family doctor, and he didn't want to talk. Pete's favorite things were talking woodworking or politics, right? You couldn't get him to. I mean, he would talk about medicine, but when he ran into me, he wanted to talk about woodworking. So I had like struck a friendship with him.
One thing I also want to mention also is he was a real mentor and kind of like a climbing father to everybody, because he would really encourage people and share his knowledge about how to climb well. A lot of times we would give up on a climb, and then he would say, "No, I'm not letting you down until you finish it." So we would have to go back, try that move over and over again. And he would give us suggestions, we call beta in rock climbing terms, about, hey, why don't you try this position, or grab this thing, or hey, there's a magic handhold around the corner or something. And he would encourage us, kind of like an uncle or a father. And with his great climbing skills, he shared that with us and really helped us get to the next level. And then I can tell you many times, he would not let me down. He would just say, okay, why don't you try this, or I want you to try that over again, or take a rest, or down climb a little bit, and then try that over again. And then, unbelievably, I was able to climb that. And he would do that with many other people as well. So very encouraging, like a mentor to a lot of people.
Yeah, the name of that climb is Peyote Blues. So that, I remember me and Rich and Pete worked on it. And at the time, we were probably in our mid-20s and really strong. And, he was probably in his later 40s and just giving it. But, age is different nowadays. Like in those days, like if you were over 40, that was just old, Or nowadays, nobody would bat an eyelash at that. But he would give those things, he'd, roll up his sleeves and get right in there with us, And so you could tell and every time I saw the guy climb, he was incredibly good,
And looking at the climbs that he has done already at Devil's Lake, and knowing about some of his other climbing, feats in other places, this guy was just like off the charts. I couldn't believe, it's very hard to believe some of the climbs that he did. If I took you, let's say, to some of the climbs that he finished at the lake, most really strong climbers would not even be able to complete it. So a lot of times you would get these really buff, strong 20-year-olds that are like struggling on a climb, and they're doing pretty well. Most of us couldn't do it, and then they would be like struggling up, and they couldn't finish it, and they would come down, and then people was like, "Oh, let me try that," and then he would climb it, and then we would call it, "Oh, Pete he just floated up the wall," and we're like, What did we just witness here, And some of these young guys are kind of licking their wounds and ego-wise. And so it's kind of funny to watch that. I think if he was really, if he was in our world today, like this time, he probably would be like as well known as, let's say, Alex Honnold, things like that. But back then in the 70s and the 60s, there was no interest in rock climbing, as a, in the general population, right?
But he, the fact that the man, his climbing life went for 65 years, he climbed his whole life, that's, it's a lot. And the fact that he kept at it, I think he enjoyed it, and I think for him it was a big part of his life. It was a big part of his social life, a big part of, just having some intellectual engagement.
Yeah, he probably climbed that thing like 1,000 times, I wouldn't doubt. And we affectionately call that route Pete's route. And afterwards, we had a memorial there with him. Not with him, but like we had a memorial with him with a lot of his friends and people from the climbing community and our Chicago Marion Club. And yeah, so we'll always remember that spot, you know, and we'll always call that Pete's Tree because I don't know why, he was always setting up that route. He really loved that route.
You know, he was a constant. The best way I'd describe it for Devil's Lake is he was like this constant that was there since the 60s, you know, and he's gone, you know. That, you know, that's hard. It's like just sort of that abrupt end to something that was sort of constant for so long. All his notoriety in climbing was just climbing when he could, and you know, I don't think Pete ever had a time when he was a full-time climber. I mean, most of it was just recreational for him. He was just a good athlete. I think he worked hard at it, but he never went out on the road, and he never made an effort to make a name for himself, where you go out and you know, have a slideshow or show up somewhere, or, you know, he didn't promote himself. So he just was known by, you know, his I mean, to the fact that you're interviewing me about him today speaks a lot, you know, that, you know, years later, 40 years later, that this guy's accomplishments, you know, 50 years are still notable enough that, you know, we're sitting here talking about it. So climbing does have that, unlike a lot of sports, it has a very, it's very history bound.
Climbing is one of my passions in life. I love sharing that with people, and I had the honor of meeting and becoming friends with Pete Cleveland, who I consider one of the great climbers of our times. And he was not only this great climber, but he really was our friend. And we're gonna miss him a lot. We're gonna remember him and talk about him for a long, long time.
So there's no doubt in my mind, you know, people will still be talking about the legend of Pete Cleveland as long as people are climbing there. That his legacy will be alive.